It's a great pleasure indeed to welcome Bob Somol back to the AAA. He's a friend in many ways and a friend of the AA as well, and has been here in the past as a visiting critic, as a lecturer. Did a workshop with us a few years ago now in the graduate school. We've been lucky enough to catch Bob on the flyover between several places, several different airports, and we convinced him that this little building was close enough to an airport that he could pop in for a few hours, which is great. Bob joins us today from the States, where he's a professor at Ohio State University, the Baumer visiting professor there, and has recently made the decision, like most of us, to leave a city with good weather and to move to the Midwest in the States, which, in my view and my understanding of the AA, is crucial to architectural invention or ideas of any kind. You need a place where the weather keeps you working, or at least inside, and in that way Bob is leaving LA, which I think will be an incredibly healthy, if traumatic, return to the Midwest. Bob has been at UCLA for several years there, teaching design and theory, as you know, at UCLA. And has formerly taught at Rice and Princeton, the GSD, and many other places along the way. Has written extensively in the last few years on many aspects of contemporary architectural discourse, in the most sustained way probably around the discourse of the diagram that emerged with great momentum in the mid-90s and carries forward in some form today, I think, nearly a decade later. He was the editor of a fantastic small book in 2000, 2001 on the use of diagrams and the work of Peter Eisenman that you all will know. A small book called Diaries, and wrote a beautiful introduction to that Peter then immediately responds to with a good deal of vengeance. Starting the next page, a text called Dummy Text and the Diagrammatic Basis for Contemporary Architecture, where he works through the idea of the diagram not simply as a kind of philosophical concept, but really as an artifact or a mechanism through which we can go through and rethink the relationships we think constitute contemporary or recent modern architectural practice. That's one of, I think, many essays on the topic of diagrams, and in a way then led to over the last few years towards the formulation of what I think is an incredibly sustained performance in its own right, that tries to situate ways of thinking about architecture today outside of a purely critical mode of analysis and work on the one side, and at the other the sort of space that's carved out and claimed by all kinds of digital practices today that also tend to naturalize architectural thinking in some overwhelming way. Bob is very much interested not in a third way or a middle ground so much as a position that can mediate between the consequences of either of those, the kind of over-determinism. I emailed, or we were emailing a couple of weeks ago, and tried to set up the terms for a little bit of an engagement tonight around topics that we're interested in. My suggestion, I think this is something we want to be exploring with here at the AA, is to create a forum or a venue like this outside the purely paid performance of an evening lecture.
What do you mean?
To get people together around a table and with a group of people interested in thinking in different ways within a room and have a conversation. Not a cat fight, so much as a conversation or a discussion that tries to take different positions and position alternatives. I think in the immediate terms, and the topic today is very much the question of how, now that research has basically inundated every other sentence within architectural discourse these days, how to think about the activities that go on in a place like this around paradigms or words or topics that can be thought of as something other than the kind of caricature of research that now floats around. So, and that's part of what tonight's supposed to open up. What's the title of the next 15 minutes?
Well, the first title that I sent you was Whatever Happened in Picking Fights, which I thought was your Jerry Springer model.
Yeah, I told him that, we definitely have to go back to a talk show model then today and just basically start some sort of an ugly fight around two different positions, which we've done in other settings and with relative degrees of success. But What Bob has done is loaded up about a dozen, not too many more images than that, for 15 or 20 minutes to give us some material to react to for a bit. That reaction, like any good episode of Springer or Letterman, will involve the audience in some way. So the idea is that this will be a conversation that goes back and forth between the front of the room and the rest of the room. So you got to not think, even though it's dark outside now, which is the other consequence of being in London this time of year, it gets dark mid-afternoon. But it's not an evening lecture. It's not the chance for a passive form of television. It's not going to be that entertaining.
Oh, there's no money involved, is what I just heard too.
But it's really a chance to have a conversation around some of the possibilities that this set of slides and some of the conversation can raise. So I'll turn it over to Bob, and we'll show some pictures.
Thank you. It's great to be here, paid or unpaid. And even if I wasn't stopping through, I'll always come to London, so it doesn't have to be in transit. And I appreciate the attempt to make Columbus seem like London, but I'm sorry. You don't win. You're not making me feel any better. Yeah, when we talked about this, I mean, I appreciate the sort of informal context. And really, it's just a kind of, this is not a prepared lecture. It was just some images thrown together in the last hour or so.
Images you just happen to have on the hard drive.
Yeah. Oh. The only ones I have, because I only say the same thing over and over and over. So this is a short form of the same over and over and over again. So these would be really super brief things, but they're like, as Dean Martin used to say when he performed, if you want to hear the whole song, buy the album. But in any case, with no particular end in mind, this is called 9 or 10 things that are better than 9 or 10 other things in no particular order. And we can argue about which are better or not better. But I think that, that's the sort of somewhat visual stimulation, I guess, that we can then have a kind of Rorschach test about. But before that, I just wanted to set up with 2 sentences, which is really a description that I sent, which is, even though many of us, and Brett primarily, although this is not directed against Brett, because I am also suspect in this, have been using the word research a lot, and we have research studios at UCLA, and I do them. And I'm just increasingly, I know the reason why we shifted to research, and I think I approve of it. In other words, there used to be the kind of dominant critical model of the architect-critic in a certain form of theoretical discourse, and that somehow research was going to take us out of academia and get us back invested in the world in a certain way. And I think that as well as overcoming a kind of hardened theory versus practice dichotomy, somehow design research, if you hyphenated it and said it fast, would push those two things together. Design wasn't exactly, practice. It was a little looser, and research wasn't exactly theory. It was a little more pragmatic, and so you could kind of make a kind of happy marriage with design research. But I think that increasingly, I think the 2 dominant areas, and really I'm indebted to Brett for this kind of identification, or that his characterization of them as the diagrammers and the processors, or the globetrotters versus the people in dark rooms, but more or less to suggest that the 2 advanced forms of research in the last 10 years or so has been a kind of investigation, kind of sort of digital computational investigation in terms of new methods of design and fabrication on the one hand, and sort of global research on the other. And I think there are good reasons why they became disciplinary techniques, but I think that they've lost 2 things. They've lost their disciplinarity, and they've lost their ability to intervene in a kind of social political context. And so partially it's that institutionalization of research that I think is problematic. In other words, what I want to get to is get off of this model of expertise that is now replaced the architect critic and move into something else, because I don't have any faith anymore in sort of data collecting of one form or the other. In other words, I think we've institutionalized these as techniques, but we've lost the ability to produce polemic or argument, i.e. about the significance of them. And so for me, sort of the end result is that I'm less interested in a science model and more interested in a politics model, which I think is this issue of the obligation to sort of make arguments both for the discipline and for the sort of social, cultural arena. And so in that sense, I'm guilty, and it's a little bit like, I also told Brett, it's a little bit like an AA meeting. It's like, hello, I'm Bob, he's Brett, we have a problem. In any case, I'll begin with 9 or 10 things, and hopefully they won't take more than that many minutes, but they'll start off a little slow. So the first thing is that the diagram is better than the index. These are actually inverted in that way. But the other thing I suppose to say about this is also kind of a tease, I suppose, about the big Thriller in Manila event in January, the boxing match between PE and RK.
Which Bob will be over to help referee. And at the end of January, Rem Koolhaas and Peter Eisenman, as of this date at least, have agreed to be in the same room together, under the same set of lights, with neutral corners, and to have a discussion. Again, discussion.
And I was fired as moderator, actually.
Yeah,
so that's why I
that was the first
a separate
decision
day.
taken.
Yeah, so that was shifted to 2 days later, sharing the stage with Jeff Kipnis. It's the Ohio day. But in any case, I've used these images a lot because I think that they set up two alternative models that emerge at the same moment that actually still have a legacy in contemporary practices. And so, for me, this sort of simultaneous rediscovery in the mid-70s of the frame structure by Peter Eisenman and Rem Koolhaas, and at the same time, but in different ways. In other words, Eisenman's reinvention, and even though I'm going to come down on one side ultimately, it's not like I don't think both projects are necessary, and in fact, still significant. In any case, Peter's radical redrawing of Corbusier's domino through this sort of series of axonometrics, in other words, the most ridiculous labor-intensive process you can imagine to bother redrawing a stupid throwaway sketch and invest it with such intentionality and significance, but such is the career of an architect, a lot of spare time. Versus the sort of almost accidental, disposable, found image that Koolhaas takes in Delirious New York of the time, the life cartoon theorem, he calls it, from this sort of popular image of the stack. So in a sense, Peter goes back and reinvents the high modern European frame, Corbusier's frame, and wants to recuperate and say that this 1913 sketch is really the first instance of self-signifying, self-referential architecture. Therefore, it's the first modernist architecture. Simply the relationship of the columns, the slabs, and the stairs are a very specific location, and so that's why he goes through all these other variations of the drawings to show which ones Corb didn't do, to show the intentionality of the one that he did. It basically becomes a kind of retroactive redrawing of a process to give Corb a process that in fact didn't exist, but more or less to defend his own methodology of producing a kind of a process. So for me, even though Peter and others might call these an index, a diagram, I mean, to me they're more accurately an index. In other words, it's a trace of a process or the trace of a real. And I reserve the term diagram really for the found cartoon image, in the sense that it's not about the temporal dynamic trace of a process, but it's about the plasticity of organization. In other words, the fact that you can superimpose one world on top of another world, and it's that form of experimentation in behaviors and relationships that's at stake. Sort of the second part of that, I suppose, is that lifestyle is better than life, or the ambient is better than the animate. Again, sort of have to mentally reverse these, but let's say that this is the project, this is the early version of the life project, or the animation project. Yeah. And this is the early version of the ambient or lifestyle project, with George Baird and Rem as rendered by Madeline Griesendorf, in all their glory, or accentuated glory, we don't know. But in any case, again, the distinction seems to me between you know, the sort of relentless seriality of Peter's redrawing of the house series to demonstrate, you know, to enforce a kind of, both in the transparent axonometric and then through the series itself, the reversibility or the temporality, the seriality of that as a kind of, to give movement or animation to something that's static. And then it's what I call also, and this will come up right after this too, a kind of hot aesthetic in the McLuhan sense. In other words, it's a high definition drawing technique that conveys one kind of information in one level, and therefore, in McLuhan's terms, it would be closed because it's less participatory, as opposed to something that's low definition, like a cartoon, like this image of the boxers on the nth floor in boxing gloves eating oysters. In other words, the architecture as one understands it is negligible or background, or it's a context within which other sorts of behaviors happen. You know, and I think broadly this is a kind of generational debate between an issue of architecture as a form of geometry versus architecture as an expression of power, or the way in which relations and lifestyles are negotiated or reinvented. Yeah, this is just another version of that. In other words, you could also say that erotics and thermodynamics are better than optics and mathematics. The sort of analyses of the San Lorenzo facade by Colin Rowe that ends up turning Michelangelo into a Corbusier, by the last one with the pilasters as Pilotti, versus Shumi's, let's say, very time-specific thermodynamic understanding of the Villa Savoye as really its significance being the erotics of decay and entropy and urine and graffiti and everything else. A follow-up to the power geometry. This image, I think, if you take this image from the mid-70s and basically add 20 years, that's what you get. In other words, imagine all those boxy axonometrics now through Maya, and imagine the cartoon now through Photoshop. In other words, it's the same sort of sensibility. In other words, now in this case, Greg Lynn's embryological house, but the idea that the object is a trace of its process, and therefore its animation and seriality. Again, it's a high definition, high-tech, expensive technology, as opposed to the sort of casual, disposable, cool medium of Photoshop versus Maya, you could say. But also the way in which one, again, is a project where the architecture is sort of stands out versus the architecture as a kind of context for different forms of behavior. In this case, not George and Rem, but a series of apparently model librarians. This is a collage for the Seattle Public Library. I think that it suggests also for me two kinds of projects today, and you know, I was identifying one as a kind of hot McLuhan medium versus a cool McLuhan medium. But I think there's another sensibility, which is the issue of the project of the beautiful and the ugly, which is to me a singular project, versus the project of the cool and the boring, which is another project. And so in a sense, I don't want to say that one work is beautiful and one is ugly or anything. I mean, in other words, I think the problem of the beautiful and the ugly are the same problem. And Mark will correct me on this, as many other things I'm about to say and stick my foot in my mouth about. And I think the cool, boring problem is a different sort of problem. And I think that the sort of classical nature of the project of the beautiful and the ugly, and then as it's architecturally rendered through the issues of proportion, scale, or disproportion, versus the cool and the boring, which I think of as being a contemporary or modern problematic. In other words, you know, with Greg's work, I think there's a question of whether it's beauty or ugliness. In other words, it doesn't mean that you actually are one or the other, but I think if you pursue the project of beauty and ugliness, that you're basically, you're guaranteed for the thing to look like architecture. If you pursue the cool and boring axis, the chances are you may well not recognize it as architecture because it may not actually raise itself above a kind of background condition. So that's the risk. And since this is about making arguments, I mean, for me, I suppose, I am more afraid of work that's ugly than works that's boring. So therefore I want to play the cool, boring game because the stakes are better for me than actually risking ugliness, which I find more offensive. But others like to be on the edge of beauty and ugliness. And I think it's ultimately, therefore, still a mannered geometric project and an optical project. Again, in terms of the cool, boring, here's one version of the cool, boring project, again, versus the ugly, beautiful project. I think the other way to think of it, again, I think this is the Hagen Island project by MBRDV. You could call it a cool and boring project, but also I think it's a project, again, about lifestyle as opposed to life, and I think it's also a project about expediency as opposed to what Greg would call intricacy. In other words, for me, this issue of intricacy is precisely connected to the problem of beauty and ugliness and geometric regulation, part-to-whole relationships, systems. In other words, what's interesting about Greg's argument today is because, and so this is a kind of articulation of the other side that I'm not part of, but to sort of render unto Caesar, that clearly what's at stake in Greg's work is a confusion about is it architecture or is it sculpture. So he's gone under great stress to make the distinction about why it's not sculpture. And for him, the difference between architecture and sculpture for Greg is that that architecture has to deploy itself through assemblies and systems, and therefore part-to-whole relationships, therefore the articulation of part-to-whole, therefore a new way to think ornament, which is one of the ways in which part-to-whole relationships get negotiated and scale, but also architectural articulation through these systems. And he says that therefore the difference between which sculpture doesn't have to do, and therefore he says the answer of why it's architecture is because it's intricate. In other words, for him, the entire definition of architecture becomes about intricacy, because intricacy is about part-to-part relationships and the articulation of building systems, let's say, or smaller parts. The next is graphics is better than ornament, or graphics is better than geometry. Again, I think again it restates the issue of expediency here versus intricacy here. In other words, I first became aware of, this is debate, it's not a debate I guess, but a discussion Alejandro and I had last night at the Bear Log, because Alejandro, this is their Downsview proposal, the short form of this project. I don't want to define projects because it's just a Rorschach test after all, no content. But let's say he's trying to overcome the distinction between formal French and informal English picturesque landscape, and he does it through sort of digital generation of systems that look random, that are in fact ordered, and in a sense he's talking about this as a kind of an index of the landscape project for Downsview, versus the OMA Bruce Mau scheme, which was basically a big green dot. Now of course there are more boards than this, but to say it's a big green dot is not too far of a stretch of the actual proposal. But the issue to me is that, and I mentioned to Alejandro last night that I thought that his interest in representation today, which is a new interest in the icon, a new interest for Alejandro, was in part driven by having lost his competition, but he wouldn't rise to the bait. But I think that the issue of the graphic for me, again, it's a contemporary. In other words, I would argue the graphic over ornament, because I think it's another way of restating the issue of the expediency of graphics, the speed, the crudity of the logo as opposed to the icon, because the graphic is immediately performative. And one of the things, in other words, this is not a scheme that is representing a park that they're going to build. It's actually about establishing a constituency and an audience and a market. In other words, it's the immediate impact in the room on the wall. It's not about trying to represent a condition that's going to sometime happen. It's about doing something. In that sense, I think graphics, or more precisely logos, are sort of the visual equivalent of speech acts. In other words, it's a form of sign, but it's actually a form of performance also. as opposed to the icon, which I think is now Alejandro's interest. Shape is better than form, or better than mass, so we get a double better in that case. Shape over, again, this sort of interest in the graphic then started to influence a kind of re-theorization that I was interested in on the question of shape, which was a kind of denigrated architectural term, at least vis-a-vis the, let's say, high-end, hot, formal articulation via geometry of form, which I think is indicative of Peter's work, but others as well. And also to differentiate shape from, which again I think comes out of the graphic and logo, from mass, or the spectacular mass of somebody like Frank Gehry. In other words, that Gehry's massing, which is a sort of optically driven, whereas maybe Peter's form is conceptually driven, that the difference between mass and shape is that mass is always pyramidal. In other words, even though it looks like it's flying around, it's basically bigger at the base than the top. And so there's always the sense, as you can see, in the way in which these models get built in the studio is a bunch of people standing around piling stuff on top of each other. So of course, that becomes the dominant trope of the massing. Versus what I consider to be the logo-like quality, the buoyant quality of shape. Again, the reason I'm arguing for this sort of issue of shape or logo or graphic is, as opposed to the classical ideas of iconography or ornament, and Alejandro is defending the use of the icon to more or less sell projects to clients. And I think that assumes that there's a collective out there that already exists and therefore gets it. In other words, he's really selling to a constituency that already exists, whereas I think the obligation of architecture is to project virtual collectives that don't yet exist, and produce the sorts of images that allow them to gather around it. So it doesn't, in a sense, so there has to be a degree of slack or abstraction that I think the logo or the shape has vis-a-vis the icon. A sort of side principle is Mitchum is better than De Niro. So again, reverse the slides. That's De Niro, obviously. That's Mitchum. These are the sort of two shots from the two versions of Cape Fear. The original that Robert Mitchum was in, and the remake with Robert De Niro. And I think that one of the things, this would be another thing that I'd be interested in hearing Mark's take on specifically. This comes out of a kind of an argument that Dave Hickey makes about these two actors, and he says that there's two ways of acting. There's the method acting, which is De Niro's school, which is you turn a subtext into a text. And then there's Mitchum's model, which is simply performing with a vengeance. And I do think that there's, again, to use the McLuhan overlay, that there's a hot kind of acting and there's a cool kind of acting. Maybe Bill Murray is our contemporary version of Mitchum after Broken Flowers. I mean, I don't know how you could disappear anymore. So it's Second City style, I guess. In any case, one of the, and it's true once you start to look at them, the kind of characteristic muggings that De Niro is prone to, it's a kind of, in other words, it's making it, it's exposing the work and in a sense the difficulty or the expression of the subtext through the text. Whereas the Mitchum model of performing with a vengeance is, at least the way Hickey describes it, that he's really not representing a character. What he's doing is producing situational alternatives or propositional alternatives. What if a guy like this were a sea captain, a detective, or whatever? And what he says, which I think is an interesting criterion, is he says that whatever Mitchum does is always, it's always plausible and always surprising. And I think that criteria of surprising plausibility is actually the, kind of criterion. This is just, I guess the last thing I wanted to say is that in terms of overcoming a kind of critical model of architecture, that in a sense, the De Niro model, you're supposed to read the performance. And there's an interesting sort of cameo that Mitchum has in the remake, where Mitchum is now a police chief, and he's watching De Niro get strip search, and in the remake, De Niro is like covered with these biblical proverbs tattooed across his body, and Mitchum looks at the guy and he says, like, I don't know whether to look at this guy or to read him. And it's sort of like a condemnation, or at least a critique or a shock over, it's not clear whether he's talking about the character Max Cady or whether he's talking about the De Niro method in general. Like, I don't know if I should look at him or if I should read him. Because in fact, the De Niro project, or the method acting project, is a kind of reading textual project. Secondly, Connery is better than Alan, or James Bond is better than Jimmy Bond. Jimmy Bond, which is Woody Allen in Casino Royale, is the guy who makes the most easy thing look difficult. In this case, he's walking across a room getting pummeled by ping pong balls. Whereas Sean Connery makes the most difficult thing look easy. In other words, he has just swum and planted bombs in the beginning of Goldfinger. And he gets out of his wetsuit and he has a tuxedo on and he's going to go in and have a martini while the bombs go off. No problem. Those are the two models of architecture today. Take something easy, make it look hard. Take something hard, make it look easy. That's it. Those are your choices. The easy model. Thank you, Neutlings. And the difficult model. The Jimmy Bond model of Scott Cohen. Finally, and then we'll discuss. There's no alternative images in this short last series, but I guess I want to say that declaration, politics, and plasticity are better than research, science, and dynamics.
Could you say that again?
Yeah. Declaration, well, I'll break out. Declaration is better than research. Politics is better than science. Plasticity is better than dynamism. And I think, for me, I have this interest in sort of the caper film, and I think that there is something about this is the original Italian Job, there's something about the caper film which is more or less the way in which, in other words, the problem with the indexical critical work to me is that it's not, in my terms, projective. It doesn't project an alternative world, or at least it's reticent about it. It's very good about critiquing the institutions that we have, but less profound about projecting alternative institutions. So the issue of, for me, it's a little bit tied to this issue of I'm tired of flexibility and dynamism. I don't care if stuff moves or it responds or it's interactive. I actually want someone to make a proclamation and try to instantiate that world. I don't want it to be a reflection of the forces of this world. And I think that that's a kind of fallacy that the mass customization crowd has fallen into, which is somehow this is going to be the perfect environment because it will react to your needs and it will react to these other forces, and all it can do is actually, in that sense, it becomes a glorified service industry. It's not actually trying to instantiate an alternative world, it's actually merely responding to the forces of this one. So for me, the plasticity is different than dynamism in the sense that plasticity says that there are other ways of organizing the world, that we can rechannel the ecologies, the economies, the bodies in a different form. I think that in some sense that means that we need to revisit the plan, because I think the plan is the plan has gotten a bad rap after the apparent failure of modernism, and that we need to recuperate the plan, even with the knowledge that the plan is going to fail, which to me is the lesson of the caper film. That in other words, no matter how they plan a diagram, it's going to get screwed.
Just makes it a great story.
Yeah, but then you have to find, you have to sort of reinvent within that series of events. But without the plan, forget it. And in any case, something like the Italian Job, which is in a sense it's the conceit of the first version of the film is that they're going to cause a huge traffic jam and therefore steal the gold payroll of Fiat. And then discover a new way of driving out the city. In other words, they expose that there's another topography in the city by virtue of how they escape because they can't use streets. So they go over buildings, through churches, under into the sewers, the subways, over water. It's basically re-describing the city and inventing a kind of an alternative city through this planned failure. So I guess, again, the last hero of mine in that case is Wile E. Coyote. Again, the kind of super calculation and planning that will always backfire and produce unexpected events. And there is something crazy and cockamamie about the ingenuity and cleverness, even if misguided, of the coyote that I prefer to the naive genius of the idiot savants of the talent school.
Yeah.
But that's it.
Great, thanks. How should we open this up? Should we? Can I throw something out to
Sure.
to get about the back and forth going, and then we'll open it up here. I think the and I'm a bit surprised in a bit to a degree to have the processors and diagrammers piece, which I wrote a year or so ago in response to an editorial that Bob and Sarah Whiting put together for an issue of Log, to have it thrown back in my face with basically very good graphics. I mean, to have illustrated an argument which was in a form 500 words or 1,000 words only. And one of the points they made at the end of that, in fact, was in the first draft I can recall, you guys saying, are we going to pick sides here?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, they were a little upset. I was somehow kind of trying to come down a little bit on both sides. And I suppose then, just to throw that back, the question would be, how might you, what are the terms by which you can reconnect these two characters? Because I think I was being very sensitive to not pick Peter versus Rem, which in my first version of the essay, in fact, they were the last, you know, they were the like paradigmatic examples of these two dominant modes of production today in architecture. A person who invests themselves totally in their tools and their way of working, which Eisenman and his generation lays the groundwork for all the digital stuff today, or at the other extreme, those guys that Rem first embodies literally by leaving London and going to New York to discover a world to then found a career around. And I think one of the, that story seems clear today, and that kind of, you know, it's a great presentation for sort of demonstrating how that has reinforced itself through a generation. I guess the question is, what are the terms by which we can reconnect the two characters, or what's being left out? I'm struck, for example, that there's no history. You know, it's like, one way to do it would be to talk about who's not in the story, the Creers, the Venturis, the people who in fact build a project or ideas around history, and in fact those are the enemies that these guys are originally railing against. Eisenman famously for going against Alexander and Venturi, Rem for the kind of process-driven work here that he found in the 70s that they were reacting against. But one of the things they seem to do together is evacuate any idea of there being a history as a means to get at architecture, which I find quite interesting. I mean, they're both quite ruthless attacks on the historical, in a sense. We turn to our processes, or we turn to the world that we find and record it to found a project. That kind of history position seems, you know, fairly well worked through in architecture as the thing that they're reacting to. But what could there be as a means to architecture other than a historical?
I mean, I think even for, well, I think for both of them actually, there's a history in both, you know, the Koolhaas and Eisenman projects, maybe not as evident as the Creer Venturi ones, but I think that, you know, I think that is one of the aspects of what makes them disciplinary. And then the issue is, you know, how does an opportunity in the discipline also produce an opportunity in the world? I mean, I think the way you've characterized those two, I mean, Alejandro talks about Peter under the guise of control and Rem under the guise of power. That Peter is uninterested in power, but interested in favor of architectural control, and that Koolhaas is interested in mechanisms of power, but not particularly interested in architectural control. And so for Alejandro, he's trying to find a third way between these two sort of father figures for him. I mean, I think it's another way to characterize that debate as maybe a prelude to January. I mean, for me, Venturi is key to my story because I think you don't have the project of the logo or the graphic without the Venturis. And so, you know, I think that the Venturis got a bad rap and they got picked up by the wrong people. They got mixed up, they got involved with the wrong crowd. You know, they were smarter than that. I also think what's interesting is the way in which and Venturi himself picks a fight with Mies, but in fact he's so indebted to Mies that it's
Appropriate to him,
really, interesting. In other words, you can't have a free-floating signifier until you have Mies liberate the surface.
Yeah.
And then you can actually start thinking about applying things to that freed surface then, I would say. And so, that's why I think OMA, in a sense, when they work on the IT campus, rediscover the Venturi that's at the heart of Mies.
Yeah.
And in a sense, it's sort of supergraphic applique to a Miesian project.
Yeah.
I think equally, for me, career has also become much more interesting. On the one hand, because of the cartooning and political dimension that he shares with his generation of Bernard and Ren, even if he's not ideologically in that way. On the other hand, I think that Peter and Creer also then are strange boxing mates in a way, in part over the issue of Rome. And this is another part of the work that got left out in a way, which is the way in which all architects go back to Rome. Peter included, Rem included, Creer, Venturi, you have to pass through a reinvention of that. And I think, Peter certainly taught entire courses on Noli and Piranesi, and as has Creer, both of them at Yale. And I think that they, that Creer tends toward the monumental and Peter to the geometric in terms of their reconfigurations of Piranesi and Noli. And I think what's the sort of different trajectory through Rome that I think is more interesting is precisely the Venturis and Smithson. In other words, the Venturis, in a certain way, see the Tanya billboard as the contemporary Rome. In a sense, it starts to set up a graphic reading of Rome, you could say. But in other words, when you hybridize Las Vegas and Rome, or the way Smithson did Passaic in Rome, you get a very different Rome. One is infrastructural and one is graphic, but those become the dominant models that, for example, OMA then uses. In other words, they would practice infrastructure plus graphics equals their project. And it's through Smithson and Venturi, I think, that project comes out.
Could we open up one more topic for you guys to follow on with this, which would be maybe your presence in the rooms? I think one of the things that's interesting to listen to the presentation is clearly that regardless of how contradictory or competing two positions might be in the form of a contemporary practice, and how the terms by which we formulate that, there is something interesting in the role you then play, which is let's call it a form of criticism or a theoretical project that sees itself as curatorial. Mm-hmm. And that's quite interesting to me in the sense that however wacky and complex and crazy architecture is, this other activity, in fact, is incredibly stable, which is to see our project is sort of situating these two characters, which is part of what January is going to be about. Figure out where in the room these two people ought to be in relation to one another, and they've been compared by 500 different terms. Were they the right terms? Are there other projects? Are there other disciplines? But what that does seem to sustain is a very distinguished modern project in which what we call the theoretical is a curatorial activity of some kind, an explanatory, a positional. And I think one of the things you hint at that seems very interesting with the projective is the idea that there's an activity to take on board that goes beyond that kind of positioning. Which you could almost see as, if it were to become popular today, would be this sort of obvious knee-jerk reaction to a post-structural, free-floating, completely open-ended activity that we call a critical or a theoretical project. And I guess that'd be the other thing it'd be interesting to talk a bit about today is actually within the talk show of this afternoon, the presence of you and your activity in relation to these guys. These guys both, in fact, have teams whose job it is to help make sure there are people like us positioning them in the complex cosmology of contemporary practice.
Yeah. Part of it, I would love to get off not talking about them anymore. But I think, how do you get them to stand in for positions so that you can take, in a certain way, biography and personality out of it and actually just establish them as projects? To me, what I find interesting is that these two moments in the mid-'70s of rediscovering a frame, the American looking to the European frame, the European looking to the American frame, and the way that really both are in conversation with Colin Rowe. I'm only interested in the way that projects have to be developed vis-a-vis previous projects. In other words, they weren't the first word and they won't be the last word, but they're an interesting halfway house to see how you unfold and develop an architectural argument. And in fact, how fecund those two drawing index diagrams are for contemporary work still. Theirs, but a whole series of other people. And I think that there's, I think that probably in the presentation I did, even though I grew up under the regime of one and became adopted by the other, and I'm looking for an escape route also. I used to be a process cop.
Yeah.
Now I try to be amused. But I think that the legacies of what you were calling the processors and the diagrammers, the computation, the global school, I do think that they really do both fail. In other words, I think that even though I have no expertise at the one, so I can't do it, I tried the other, and I think that they've both been institutionalized in ways that don't, I think that people have started to buy their own press. In other words, they think that they've actually discovered the facts of a situation, as opposed to, you don't go to these sites to report the facts. You go because you have a problem, something sticking in your craw, and you go there to find an answer for it. In other words, it has nothing to do with the place you're going to. It's got to do with, the Venturis needed to find an answer to a disciplinary problem, and they went to Las Vegas. It wasn't a fact-finding mission about Las Vegas any more than any other architectural site. And so I think if you don't go with a disciplinary problem and an argument, you're going to be stuck there forever because you'll never find anything significant. Or you have to be very lucky.
A famous example for them being they take their students from Yale out of the studio to Las Vegas for 10 days. And the article that's written on Las Vegas is published in this country the spring before. Right? And it's exactly the point, that they go there with the position. And in fact, they modulate to a degree the position, but the material is there.
But I think that, today, that there's and friends of ours are starting to believe the pseudoscience witchcraft that they practice, that somehow no, they're the new Chris Alexanders. No, we've really mapped the entire world and its reality, and we can now rearrange, it's just, it's like whack, it's craziness. The other example, this is another line from Venti, which said there's two kinds of people in the world, pirates and farmers. Pirates cross territories and, whatever, and farmers build fences, and that I think that, this Dutch school, they were pirates, but they became farmers. And I think there's a problem with farming.
Can we go back to the two slides where you're talking about performance? Robert De Niro and Mitchum. Both of them are sort of often confused because they're kind of taken to be exemplars of kind of something that used to be called method acting. Now it seems to me actually in some sense De Niro really is, but shows how bad method acting. Mitchum's both too smart and too stupid to actually acquire a technique. He's just a sort of extraordinarily beautiful object that gets kind of filmed. And he feels like he's lucky enough that the camera kind of likes him. He doesn't have a technique. He just sort of does it, and I imagine in a way in the rest of his life he's exactly the same, except that he's not beautiful because there's no camera there. Whereas De Niro comes out of all those seminars on acting technique and kind of has all that stuff, like if you want to act a certain personality you should be doing something entirely different, like you should be thinking of an entirely different object in order to loosen up your technique. You can see the most absurd version of that in Anthony Hopkins' performance in The Silence of the Lambs, where, like in a method acting way, he's decided that the thing which will allow his murderous personality to show is by identifying with a cat. And so quite often you can see the impermissible overlap of the cat into the performance. There's always and that shows you there's always, like in that respect,
Right.
a tendency to naturalize the cat. I.e., actors like architects, once they acquire a technique, it's not enough for it to be a technique, it has to become a kind of ontological basis. And that kind of brings me to, it seems to me it brings me to the next question, which is why the moment you're employing something like a technique or whatever, it's very important that you never resolve things. I mean, it seems to be the one missing dimension, I mean, I really enjoy what you said, is the commitment to irresolution, which characterizes, you know, your plot, your otherwise you could say, you know, what you're standing for in the exemplary categories which you put forward is like the new Vitruvius. I mean, it's very rational. There's not a single thing that you say that you couldn't link back to Alberti or Vitruvius, and it's fine by me. What's at stake, I mean, and in play is precisely this kind of thing, it seems to me, of the performance, which is where personality comes in. It's not that the architects are, importantly, celebrities. It's not that their person is interestingly involved in the work. But on the model of a personality, they're like continuously irresolute. And it seems to me that sort of modernism, like classicism, believes fundamentally in resolution. But what's characteristic of a contemporary condition, really, is a certain commitment to irresolution. So that, as it were, it would be vulgar, if true, to say, but these characters are all still caught up in the Oedipus complex. Of course they are. It's that they have no intention of resolving it. Actually, the only moment that De Niro's technique is challenged is not by trying to resolve the technique or get better. It's actually when he faces Al Pacino in Heat. And at a certain level, they sit there at the table and they're both so awful as actors that they suddenly get good because they're confronted with the vacuity of the other. If you see what I mean. And at that moment, the performance becomes really quite touching.
Yeah.
Well, that bodes well for January.
I don't know, yeah. The actor's studio.
Yeah.
When was
So when
the
you get them
first
together,
time
you just say, you know, what's it like getting older?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think apparently George Peppard was a method actor, and he played with Mitchum in one movie, and he went up to Mitchum because he really wanted to learn the craft of acting. And he asked Mitchum, you know, did he study the Stanislavski method? And Mitchum said, no, only the Smirnoff method. But I mean, I think this issue of performance is an interesting one. We were talking about it, you know, I mean, given that Alejandro at the Barrel was doing the representation lecture series, the idea of a performance series would be...
I mean, that was what the term connects these,
Yeah, and you know, I mean, when you think of the architectural performances, I mean...
But that's also when it comes apart, because the moment you invoke performance as a sort of element of technique, even performance in a kind of anti-humanist way, I don't just mean personality, you reach exactly the problem very quickly that the philosopher Austin kind of had when he for the first time develops in his kind of theory of language the idea of the performative. When Austin's trying to argue at one level very sympathetically that not all language is what he calls a constitutive, that is to say, it's not all sentences take the form of saying things like it is raining.
yeah.
Some sentences actually, or some propositions, and it's always interesting as to what's an architectural proposition, complete an action by the very utterance. And so he says there are things like I promise, I will,
Mm.
whatever,
Mm.
which complete the action. But then it's exactly where the problem of history, the third term of Venturi, comes back. He has a nightmare about the integrity of a performative, where one of his examples, you can tell this is generated by someone who was sort of politically aware in the mid-1950s. He said, what happened if Her Majesty the Queen went to a shipyard in Glasgow and was just about to say, or indeed had even launched the bottle of champagne against the hull of the ship, and is about...
It's a kind of crazy version of the Eisenman legacy out of, I mean, I love Scott's work, it's just, I find it's a little like prison work. It's another one of these time-intensive, what I respect about Scott is, he still does it by hand in a certain way.
It's the great problem with private dentistry.
Although it is, I suppose, in one way, the classic definition in theory would be that you got to look for a problem before there can be a theory.
Well, this is what I was saying, the whole, Mark will remember this as what we all remember, that the big thing in the 80s, maybe it's still a big thing, but was problematized. Everything had to be problematized. You took problem, you put eyes on it, it's like problematize that. You got to problematize that. You didn't problematize that. Everybody wanted to make a problem. Scott is the king of making problems for himself. Tying his shoelaces together, whatever it takes. Nobody wanted to solvatize. And now I think we're where we actually want to do that.
Now there's a sort of solving excess. Yeah. Having seen the MBRDB, the new version of Pharmax is just coming out, and it's Pharmax to the max. It's
KM3.
Quite amazing.
It's actually literally KM. It's really
one square meter of paper. Yeah. Let's open it up. People out here. Come on, you promised me you would participate in this. This is not an evening lecture. So please, anybody.
Otherwise, you're disproving my theory that cool leads to greater participation and hot leads to less participation.
Exactly.
So if you don't participate, I'm going to think it was hot and I'm going to really be bummed out.
Yeah, I have a third question, sort of more of some statement. Wouldn't you say that the cool is a lot more accessible, and therefore there's necessarily something a lot more demagogical about it?
Interesting. Yeah, that would be, I'm sure.
Or to put it simply, it's a lot easier basically to get what runs up to then say Peter.
What about Gary? I'm not sure it's easier to get. I'm not sure that. I don't know. You have to do this kind of post-occupancy analysis interviewing thing, but do people get Porto and Seattle and not get the Wexner Center and the Columbus Convention Center? I'm not sure. I think probably all people think they're both wacky and they go there. In the academic world, in the world of in the know, is it easier? I think that there's a way in which the problems of the world are sloughed off with the Koolhaas model, which is to say, this was a constraint, that was a constraint, this is a constraint, that's a zoning envelope, way to do that. It seems like just the dumb addition of a series of strict requirements that then ends up producing something that's quite surprising, given the fact that it seemed to be just a serial accumulation of stupid demands. Whereas I think the Peter exercise, which is to sort of release the the repressed element in a context, is like Scott's. It ends up to me looking more De Niro-like in the sense that it looks more tortured, and therefore it stands out as architecture, which I guess is the distinction I was making, and maybe that what you're calling demagoguery in a way is the fact that it slips into the back, the cool work slips into the background, and therefore, I guess that would be the populist critique, the critique of populism, which is that it's pandering. But I would be hard pressed to say that work was pandering in that way. So, I understand the distinction, and that would be. I think that's Peter's argument. Like, I'm doing difficult stuff. It takes a lot of attention. I'm not just. He would use Gary as his alter ego in that case. Like Gary is just doing Schwarzenegger spectacles, and I'm doing, you know, film, you know, Bresson. I'm got a close-up of a doorknob for 30 minutes, you know, and it's just like, you know, I'm straining people's attention. That's what critical practice is, as opposed to merely satisfying their optical passive lust through spectacle. You know, I mean, so for him, Gary is Schwarzenegger. I don't know. I mean, he doesn't actually, in that sense. I mean, that becomes his straw man for why you stay true to this other attentive, difficult project. But I don't think the OMA project plays itself out in those two sides.
I suppose another term, if we were to throw out history earlier, is one way to try and triangulate. The other obvious one, which you just hinted at again, is the relationship of architecture to the city or urbanism. And arguably, I mean, there is a crowd that leaves for Rome or for Las Vegas, and arguably an OMA kind of project depends entirely on getting out to the city to understand it, record it, and transform it through the project. But it does seem that relation between architecture and urbanism is changing of late. I mean, the urbanism isn't the linchpin necessarily that it has been in a disciplinary sense before. I mean, it's almost been institutionalized as a kind of topic. We have several programs here where urbanism is kind of added to the term to kind of fill it out.
To mix in.
Yeah. We don't yet have a course where there's just and urbanism. You know, it's just something and urbanism. What else up there today? People, you gotta help us here. We're not gonna leave.
I had another
We're not getting paid, why should we leave?
Another small question, since you mentioned Gary a couple of times. Don't you think that, say, there's something odd about his work in the sense that from the outside it does seem to have all the hallmarks of, say, the indexical work. Of
Gary.
Yeah, the hot work. The, let's say, you know, that sort of lineage that you described, the processual. And yet it's not the case if you look at both the way it is presented and the way it is consumed generally. In other words, to put it even more dumbly, there are projects of Peter's that look like Gary's, and yet they have completely different predicaments, no?
I mean, I guess the question is, I mean, I'm always a little bit concerned about they, look completely alike, because I think as soon as you look at them a little closer, they couldn't seem more different. But I mean, I understand that there's a convention that, like, oh, that's that crazy, piley, warpy stuff.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that you touched on. I mean, for me, the issue that we just like the Gary work is the model of genius. I mean, I think that what makes Rem and Peter closer actually is the fact that they are trying to distance themselves. In other words, it needs to be discursively translatable to somebody else so that somebody else could undertake the job at a distance. Whereas I think in Gary's office, you need the master there to decide that you crumpled it the right way. I mean, not exactly exaggerating. I mean, there's the gestural project in that way. It's not disciplined by something that's translatable to other people. It's actually, there's only one source for it, which I think isn't true of the LA school in general. I mean, I think it's Tom Main would be another one. And therefore, Peter regulates it through the geometric discipline, through the grid, banally put. Frank doesn't discipline the work that way. It really does start as a pile of stuff, and he kind of moves it around a little bit. And Ren disciplines the work in a different way. I mean, discursively, or in terms of a story or a scenario, and it's not disciplined formally in the same way, which is what Alejandro means by control versus power. But
could we say that again, because of the way of connecting them, is the appeal today, I mean, it is the presentation in terms of the debate around the disciplinary reach towards architecture, because arguably that's what the two guys share, absolutely. You argue it in different ways. But I mean, in a place like this, where some days of the week, I imagine if it's that second term, the association, the architectural association, and the stuff other than architecture, it's interesting for us to be thinking about. And certainly a lot of people within a place like this are doing that in different ways. The forms of outside expertise, the kinds of clients, the way in which we interact with the city itself, and there's a huge body of work that works on that, or whether there's something within architecture that becomes the terms to draw back in on. I think in a way, what you keep coming back to over and over again and arguing for, it seems to be a disciplinary position, i.e. that there is an architecture to keep alive, reinvent, to, you know, that become the terms to return to a generation later. And arguably that's what these two guys you demonstrated have been doing for a good 30 or 40 years, holding the keys, keeping architecture there in a world where it seems to be disappearing either into commercial production, development, or, you know, more lately into interactive media and all these other kinds of disciplines. And is that a term by which to then connect your activity with the activities that you're showing on the wall? That, i.e. a theoretical project or a critical project. But I should think Tafuri would be interested these days in
The maintenance of the...
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think despite the rhetoric, there's a kind of deep disciplinarity that's obvious in the Olme work that's no different than Peter's project, which you associate more directly with that legacy. But I mean, I think like the Gary thing, I think the other thing is that Gary's work was always figure-driven and Peter's was always form-driven. I mean, I think that there's an argument that the opposite of form isn't function, the opposite of form is figure. And that, you know, so in that sense, maybe there are ways to recuperate Gary into a disciplinary lens, even though for me it's a kind of gestural expressionism. But I think that there are, if you go back to the fish before the more abstract sort of things, with the guardhouse, you know, the sort of lifeguard houses and kind of assembly of almost collage figures as a little pavilionized campus. The later projects smooth out the differences and abstract them, but they're basically still a kind of still life of figures. And I don't think that Eisenman has to struggle to produce any form of figuration. It has to come through a mannerism of geometry that by default or by accident gets you figure, but it doesn't start there. He couldn't be comfortable starting there. There was one moment, the kind of awkward archaeology moment, where he was somewhat comfortable by saying, well, that existed before on the site, so I'm going to rebuild that castle. But you could say he just couldn't quite go there.
Yeah, the project he showed here in the 80s, the famous castle.
But since with Gary there is no kind of explicit desire to, if you like, theorize or rationalize that process or present it as such, where does that leave him, the sort of clear distinction that you drew? I mean, basically the question I'm asking, do you think
nowhere in academia, that's where it leaves him. I mean, maybe there are other places, there are probably many other better places to be.
But you think it's cool?
Gary? No.
You think it's cool? Does that make him hot?
I do think it is that's a little bit why I suppose I was not jokingly referring to the idiot savant model. And that to me is actually a kind of group of, happens to be on the digital side, but a group at SciArc that Michael speaks has underwritten with the concept of design intelligence. Now there's a concept that never should have fit that group in any way, shape, or form, but maybe that's Michael's genius, is to apply it exactly where you couldn't find any intelligence at all. But in any case, I do think that the Gary model is a little bit like the idiot savant also.
Well, kind of master form.
That's talent. There's practices don't play in those kinds of mediated institutions of critical writing and academia, and they play in other places, which is why Peter can almost easily, like a straw man, say he's playing to this kind of popular spectacle like Schwarzenegger, but he's not, in terms of where it leaves him, I'm sure, I think the expression is laughing all the way to the bank. But for our purposes, let's say, in a university context, it's not something that is a pedagogical model that's possibly useful.
Weeping all the way to the book.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I just saw the clock and promised Bob I wouldn't keep him too late tonight. So we're going to wrap it up. Thanks, everybody. Let's. The questions can then be up at the bar. Let's go up and have a beer up there. And
much better.
Well, thanks very much.